So I'm very happy to be here today with Laura Schiffman. I have been a DPA a long time in a lot of roles, but I'm currently a senior advisor in the water division. And as I said, very happy to be here with Laura to talk about the RDA permit in Massachusetts. So as many of you know, the RDA permitting process in Massachusetts has been underway for a couple of years. Today, what we're hoping to do is to update you on where we are with the permit, the RDA permit, what you can expect in 2024 in terms of the permitting process, as well as stakeholder outreach. Next slide. So we have a few questions that we're going to go over today. What is Residual Designation Authority? We're going to take just look at a snapshot of what's happening in Massachusetts as well as the rest of the country. We'll review the Massachusetts permitting timeline for 2024. We'll dig in a little bit to the water quality violations that are forming the basis for this permitting action. And we'll end with some stakeholder outreach activities and questions that we're hoping those of you who are interested in will weigh in on. Next slide. So without getting into too many of the nitty-gritty details, the basis for the Residual Designation Authority comes from the following. So the Clean Water Act, Section 402P, requires that EPA regulates certain sources for an NPDES permit. So think about MS4, think about a wastewater treatment plant facility permit, think about an industrial permit for certain kinds of discharges. The Clean Water Act also allows for other sources to be regulated. That is, the residual sources of stormwater and other kinds of pollutants going into our water bodies. That's what we're talking about today. And we're allowed to use, indeed we must use, our residual designation authority when certain conditions exist. Those conditions are that there are discharges that contribute to a violation of water quality standards. There's this, that a discharger is a significant contributor of a pollutant to a surface water body, or there is controls are needed based upon a wastewater allocation coming from a TMDL. Next slide. So just really, the reason I'm doing this slide is not to go into the details of RDA around the country. We have Lindsay, you can call her later if you want to get more details. The point here is to show that our region is not the only one that has been subject to RDA petitions. Up in the upper left corner, you have Region 10. There's a couple of military bases that have gotten petitions. In Los Angeles, there's a very active RDA permit underway with the ports. They are regulating entities with greater than 5 acres of impervious surfaces, and because they're not the permitting authority, the local water board will be implementing that permit. If you look towards the middle of the country, you have the Los Alamos Lab, and then continue over to the East Coast where there are a couple of petitions in Region 3. That's the bottom star. Those are in Baltimore and Delaware Bay watersheds, and then you get up to the Northeast. So the residual designation permit in South Portland has been underway, I think, for over a decade. The ones that Region 1 is actively engaged with are the ones in Great Bay and the Boston area. Great Bay received a petition by the Conservation Law Foundation on February 15th of 2023, so just under a year ago. And the EPA has not yet acted in that position, but there's a lot of good work going on behind the scenes to deal with a lot of those issues. In the Boston area, which is what we're going to talk about now, we have 3 petitions. Next slide. Okay, there's a lot on this slide, but I'll just kind of talk about the general chunks. This basically is what we're doing in a very wordy nutshell. We received 3 petitions. The first petition was from the Conservation Law Foundation and the Charles River Watershed Association on the Charles River in 2019. In 2020, we received identical petitions from the Conservation, well, not identical, but similar petitions from the Conservation Law Foundation for the Mystic River Watershed and the Neponset River Watershed. And basically, those petitions requested that EPA utilize its residual designation authority to regulate, that is, issue permits to all commercial, industrial, and institutional properties, and we refer to them as CII properties, that had greater than 1 acre, that were 1 acre or greater, and they also wanted us to include large multifamily housing units. Okay, so those 3 petitions we received, and we then needed to act on them. Those petitions were based on concerns that 303 D, water quality impairments, as well as pathogen and phosphorus TMDLs were being violated in those 3 watersheds. So in September of 2022, EPA preliminarily designated CII parcels of 1 acre or greater of impervious cover for all 3 watersheds. So you'll note a couple of differences between the original petition and our determination. One is we are not at this time going to be issuing permits for multifamily entities, or we didn't put them in the determination. We said we would look at them later. And we are regulating entities with 1 acre of impervious cover, not those that are simply 1 acre in size. Impervious cover, as you'll see, the working definition that we have in our preliminary determination is that it's any surface that prevents or significantly impedes the infiltration of water into underlying soil. So we're talking about entities, their parking lots, their roofs, impacted soils, that kind of thing, anything that's preventing stormwater from infiltrating. So we are now in the process where we're developing the permitting framework, and we hope to issue a draft permit in the fall of 2024. Next slide. So just to put it in very general terms, as I just said, the draft permit target is for fall of 2024. We have a regulatorily mandated public comment period of at least 30 days. This is important for all of you to know, because anyone who has comments on this permitting process are invited to formally submit comments. EPA has a legal obligation to look at all of those comments, and then at some point, we will issue a final permit with a response to those public comments. Next slide. Laura, I think you're on mute.
Yep. Thank you, Anne. So thank you for giving that great overview. And I want to give a little bit more specific information on the pollution reduction and water quality impacts that this RDA effort would have in Massachusetts. So just to give a little bit of historical context, through previous NPDES regulations, we've seen significant reductions in CSOs and illicit discharges that have gone into our water bodies. That's really positive. TMDLs have really decreased the amount of phosphorus discharges from wastewater treatment plants to our water bodies. And so now the last really big remaining source of pollution is stormwater runoff. And the MS4 permit remains the primary regulatory mechanism to deal with this kind of pollution from public properties. Just like many of you are aware, implementing these permits from 2003 onwards, or earlier in the case of Boston. But many of the private properties that Anne was describing earlier may have little or no water quality controls in place, making them potentially significant sources of pollution. So this residual designation effort would contribute to controlling stormwater pollution coming off of these properties. So it's important to really understand the differences between these two permitting schemes. The MS4 permit remains, like I said, this primary mechanism for stormwater management at the municipal level. And that's because it regulates the discharges from the municipally owned properties and the municipally owned storm sewer system. It's the MS4 permit has specific requirements that are related to water quality impairments and TMDLs that may allow a municipality to take credit for stormwater management systems implemented on private property, but private property isn't regulated by MS4. So the RDA in turn will regulate those discharges for those specific properties that will be targeted by EPA, and that will reduce the stormwater load entering the MS4 system or into the water body if there's a direct discharge. Both of the permits rely on adaptive management. That's a really big focus of EPA's permitting scheme for stormwater in Region 1. And those, and specific stormwater management actions that will address impaired waters. And just again, it's important to note, as Anne described, that neither permit directly regulates discharges from residential sources, whether those are single family or multifamily residential properties.
And Laura, it's been about 10 minutes just to give you the halfway mark.
Great, thank you. So looking at the graph on the right, one of the things we want to really show is here, the nutrient pollution in the 3 watersheds. So we have the Charles, the Mystic, and the Neponset on our, for each of the 3 watersheds out here. And then the y-axis is phosphorus loads in pounds per year. This is the result from either TMDL analyses or technical analyses that EPA has conducted. And what we're showing here is in the blue boxes for the Charles and the Mystic, where there are TMDLs for phosphorus, is that those are the allowable TMDL loads, basically the amount of phosphorus that the river system can accommodate naturally without creating an impairment. And one other point that I want to make is that we're using phosphorus as a proxy pollutant here for all watersheds, just to be able to make easy comparisons for our presentation and going forward for our pollution reduction estimates. The red boxes in these plots are additional stormwater loads that are untreated, and that's the case. We have these outlined here in all 3 watersheds. And the gray boxes are also uncontrolled stormwater sources or loads. And the gray, but it's important to note that the gray boxes actually are just the loads coming off of these CII properties that Anne was describing that have 1 acre or more of impervious cover. And the little percentages in the boxes give you an idea of what that percentage is of the total load. So in the Neponset, it's basically 15% of the load comes from those CII properties. If you're wondering what the red boxes is, it's basically any other untreated road load coming from roadways, walkways, municipal and other public property, residential property, and so forth. So in the Neponset, we have about 34,000 pounds of phosphorus that's entering the watershed each year. 15% of that is coming from CII properties. So this is helpful in our determination and understanding of the impact that RDA may have. And using this technical analysis and this information that we have, we can now really understand how much potential additional reduction of pollutant load we will get through this RDA program. And that will obviously take some of the burden off of the municipal property or municipal responsibility. So I want to take a little bit more of a closer look at CII loads. And here we're looking at the contributions of these CII properties to the watersheds. And it's really just those 3 types of land uses that we've included here. I've normalized the percent load contribution for each watershed, just so we're able to easily compare. And I've broken them out into 3 acreage thresholds of impervious cover. So 1, 2, and 5 acres for the Charles, Mystic, and Neponset. And what's really clear here is that you can see is that in all of the scenarios in all 3 watersheds, the distribution of land use for those 3 properties is very similar, which really justifies the case for EPA's determination that was put out in September of 2022. Obviously, what's not included here are the MS4s, or public property roadways, residential loads, which are also large sources that you saw on the previous slide. But I'm just highlighting the fact that we have a really high contribution of commercial and industrial land uses. So now what we did next was basically estimate what the RDA permitting program can contribute to for each watershed in terms of the pollution reduction that can be achieved. We have all 3 watersheds outlined here. Again, the Neponset is highlighted in green on the right-hand side here. But for each of the watersheds here on the x-axis, you have the number of private parcels that may be regulated. And on the y-axis, you have the potential pollution reduction that could be achieved. Each point on the curve is actually a different acreage threshold of CII properties that could be regulated. So 5 acres, 2 acres, 1 acre threshold, half an acre, a quarter acre, and basically all parcels. And in some cases, the data point for all parcels is cut off. That's just because we wanted to preserve the x-axis for easy comparison. And when you look at these graphs, it's you notice that the slope changes at some point. We refer to that as the knee of the curve, and where the slope really starts to flatten, and that's where the triangles change from red to black. And what we're trying to do here is basically identify the greatest pollution reduction that we can achieve, balanced by the number of parcels that could be impacted by this permitting framework, which again emphasizes and supports the decision-making that EPA included in its September 2022 determination. So if we end up with the residual designation program that ends up regulating properties that are greater than 1 acre of greater than 1 acre of impervious cover, the end result that we would get for this residual designation program would ultimately be 8.8% reduction, additional percent reduction of unattenuated or untreated stormwater load in the Charles, 12.4% in the Mystic, and then 9.2% additional reduction in the Neponset. So when you think about what this looks like for your municipality, you might be curious, well, what's the number of properties that that are located in my municipality, or what are the loads that we're dealing with? And so here what we have is the number, or the counts or numbers of private CII properties in each municipality, broken out by the sizes. Again, greater than 1 acre, 2 acre, this dark blue, and then 5 acres is the yellow. And it's important to keep in mind, because I know Boston's on the line, and all the other municipalities basically that are not entirely within the Neponset River watershed, the portion or the number of properties that are represented is only that falls within the Neponset River watershed here. For those that share watershed with the Charles, or that share the watershed with the Charles, or share jurisdiction with the Charles River watershed, those numbers would increase, of course, for properties counts. But for those in the Neponset, this is what we have here. You also have the totals in the parentheses next to the municipality's name. These are estimates based on the tax assessor's code. This is what we used for our analysis. There's more detail in documents that we'll be posting on our website soon on the methodology here. But the other thing that we wanted to share with you was the total phosphorus loads that are coming from those properties that are outlined here. And in this case, I'm showing any property that's greater than 1 acre or more of impervious cover. Again, now broken out by commercial, industrial, and institutional land uses. I'm also including other public properties that are regulated through MS4, so roadways and municipal properties, in gray, just for a point of comparison. And again, these are the number, or the loads are only load estimates that are coming from properties within the watershed, and not necessarily the entire jurisdiction of the municipality if the municipality is located in two watersheds. So we know that as we're working with municipalities and other stakeholders, one of the things that there's going to be a lot of interest in is these data sets, and so and how this new regulatory framework may impact property owners. EPA's worked really closely with contractors and internally on putting together some resources that we're very close to releasing. The first one I want to highlight is an online impervious cover dashboard. And this is what you see here. There's a screenshot. This is obviously a screenshot for the Charles River watershed, but the Neponset is going to have something that looks very similar. That it's for the Neponset, of course. And here, what you're able to do is up on there, it's going to be a slider up on the top here where you're able to set an impervious cover threshold using a little slider. And ultimately, the map will update with how much pollutant load is coming off of those properties. It'll show you the number of properties impacted. It'll show you the land uses and basically the information that's over here on the screen. You can obviously zoom in and out. You can actually select by municipality as well if that's of interest. There's lots of little ways to use this dashboard that could be helpful for a municipality or a property owner to identify locations where you could put best management practices. Are we close to time, Patrick?
Oh, we're at 20 minutes now. You got it.
I'm so sorry. All right, we have a few more slides here. The second resource is this community-specific technical information sheet. I'm just going to quickly go through this. And here, what we're offering is for each municipality, you get how many properties EPA has identified through its analysis that are likely RDA permittees, how much pollutant is coming off of these properties, and where these properties are within the municipality. And both these resources will be made available really, really soon, hopefully, so municipal officials can use these for planning of green infrastructure and other stormwater controls. Communication, education, we heard was a big piece here. So I'm going to hand it over back to Anne to talk to you a little bit more about some of the stakeholder outreach work.
Thanks, Laura. So I think Laura and I spoke much more slowly today than we did during practice. So if people could just give us a couple more minutes, that's awesome. So we are engaging in stakeholder outreach for this permit, which is unusual. As you all know, EPA normally doesn't do this kind of outreach for the permits that you've probably been involved with, certainly not pre-release of a draft permit. So we are trying to accomplish a lot with the stakeholder outreach, and I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about that. So in the fall of 2020 was when EPA engaged in its first round of stakeholder outreach for this permit. Again, this is a new thing, right? These kinds of private entities have not been regulated before, and that was why we reached out. We were lucky to have Pat and CBI at the table then. They held 5 focus groups with NIOP, the hospital, university, colleges sector, Mass Municipal Association, NGOs, and the 495 Partnership. A really great report was prepared. It's 25 pages long. It's got a lot of important thoughts in it, and you can find it at the website that I've cited there. Next slide. So despite the fact that it's 25 pages, there are certain themes that have come out over and over again. One is the permit approach and how it's going to be administered. Many of you must be very, very interested and have opinions on the role of municipalities. What role will they play in the intersection between the RDA and the MS4? Should this permit come out in phases? Should we do everything at once? Should we go after the big guys first? How will tracking and accounting happen? So when these private entities are getting their phosphorus reduction, their pathogen reductions, how will that be tracked and accounted? How will compliance be determined? Who will enforce? BMP implementation is a huge issue with this permit because particularly the highly urbanized areas, the entities that may not have a lot of room for BMP implementation are going to have some challenges. Timing for BMP implementation is a big deal for some of these private folks because they need to plan, right? They're going to get a new roof in X number of years. They're going to redo their parking lot. They need to understand what's coming, and that opinion and that concern came out very, very strongly in that first set of focus groups. As I said earlier, who to target? Should we start with the big folks or should we go after all sources of stormwater and runoff from single family? You've heard both Laura and me say we've made a preliminary determination where we've set some boundaries around that. There's an issue of multiple regulations. You have inconsistency potentially at the local, state, and federal requirements. And then, of course, you've got this really big question of the MS4 RDA overlap. And finally, funding. Many of you talked about stormwater utilities. We are not going to have time today, I can already tell, to really dig into that. EPA is extraordinarily interested in understanding how this effort can actually support rather than take away incentives for the development of stormwater utilities and other funding mechanisms. Next slide. So the stakeholder outreach, just very quickly, we are currently, as you're all aware, re-engaging with stakeholders right now. This is our first effort to reach out in a watershed. We really thank Neponsit for inviting us here today. In the spring, we're going to be seeking feedback, particularly on permit implementation, and also sharing information with stakeholders. Education is important to us, and we want to make sure that people understand why this is happening and the community and environmental benefits that could result from this permit. And then in the summer, after listening to folks, we will continue to refine options for our permit framework. Next slide. So just to put a fine point on this, as we're going forward, we have 3 real goals of the stakeholder outreach. One is to seek feedback on permit implementation challenges. The thing that's not going to be that useful, however, is to just hear about the problems and not hear from those of you who have opinions and ideas about strategies for how to address those problems. We want to facilitate information sharing, as I've said earlier, education, and then we want to foster foundational collaborations, things that those of you outside of EPA can start to do that are separate from the work that EPA is doing. Next slide. And on that final point, the idea here is, and we saw this happen in South Portland, Maine, you know, this is really big and complicated and involves a lot of different parts. And as I said, you know, Laura and I will be working on the permit and the fact sheet and all this stuff that we're supposed to be doing as EPA, but there's a lot of other things that could be happening in the 3 affected watersheds in the Neponset to look at some of the other issues that will be arising. So BMP implementation, large scale BMP infiltration, siting challenges, that's going to require a lot of conversation outside of the EPA purview on how that's going to happen. Many of you talked about climate change and resiliency. There will be resiliency benefits because of green infrastructure implementation and certain BMPs as a result of this permit. You know, we need help letting people know that flooding could potentially be addressed. Heat island impacts could be addressed. There'll be greater infiltration of groundwater. And then, of course, the whole reason we're really doing this is there's going to be water quality benefits in the Neponset. So we need help getting the message out on the benefits of this permit and also addressing some of the challenges. Again, I can't emphasize enough that we, like many of you, believe that funding and fee structures are extraordinarily important. EPA has no regulatory authority to require the implementation of a stormwater utility. We have given workshops. I have been personally involved in those. Laura has been involved, but we do not have authority to regulate those. We would very much welcome conversations on what we can do, how we can support the development of funding structures in the Neponset and the other watersheds. And we're very, very interested, as I think I've hopefully, and Laura's made clear, we're very interested in your ideas. Next slide. So here's what we're not seeking feedback on, just to be super clear. We don't want feedback on whether or not EPA should be doing this, the parcel thresholds, specific permit details. That's stuff that we have to do kind of on our own. We're also not seeking consensus from groups of people. That would be a violation of FACA. What we are looking for are all these things on the left. I'm not going to go through them again. I think I've talked about them. And I think we're on to the last slide. Yes. So again, I'm not going to be able to go into these, but these are the kind of 5 buckets of questions that we're hoping to get feedback on. This presentation will be made available on the Neponset website as well as EPA, and we do welcome your feedback. Ian also said earlier before we came on that Neponset would take questions from folks who don't want to be identified, and they would then pass on questions to us. So any way you want to get us feedback or questions, we are open to this. I want to thank Neponset again for hosting us. I want to thank all of you for coming. It was really great to see all of the interest in this permit, and we look forward to working with all of you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Pat.
Great, Anne, thank you. And thanks for the great thorough presentations. I know we have short of time here. So again, we know this is just the beginning. Many of you will have thoughts and questions after. Really encourage you to circle back through the Watershed Association to do that. And then certainly EPA can come back in time to continue the dialogue. Let me just start with the first question that Zach raised. And Laura, this is the slide about percentage.
Oh, yeah. Excuse me, Patrick. Can I just make a point of interest? I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now that we're transitioning to questions and discussions. That sound good?
That sounds good. Thanks, Ian, very much.